Things you didn't know about Cheech and Chong that will blow your mind. Introduction. Everybody thinks they know Cheech and Chong. The smoke-filled van, the mispronounced words, the giggling, the Dave's not here energy that turned into a full-blown comedy empire. For most people, that's the whole story. Two guys who got famous by being funny about weed. But if that's all you know, you're only seeing the tip of the joint. Underneath the stoner image is a story packed with strange coincidences, real legal battles, surprising career detours, and a partnership that was a lot more complicated than the movies ever let on. Today we're digging into the facts that never made it into the trailer, the ones that actually explain how two very different men accidentally built one of the most recognizable comedy brands in American history. Stick with us, because the last one on this list might change the way you look at their entire career. A partnership born from circumstance, not friendship. Most comedy duos have an origin story built on friendship first, laughs second. Cheech and Chong flipped that completely. Richard Marin, the man the world would come to know as Cheech, grew up in South Los Angeles, the son of a police officer. He wasn't chasing a stage career at all. He'd enrolled at Cal State Northridge to study pottery, of all things, and had every intention of living a quiet, artistic life shaping clay rather than shaping punchlines. That plan changed because of a decision that had nothing to do with comedy, the Vietnam War. Facing the draft, Marin made the call to leave the country rather than risk being sent overseas, and he ended up in Vancouver, Canada, working odd jobs just to stay afloat. He wasn't looking for a stage. He was looking for rent money. Tommy Chong's path looked nothing like that. Born in Edmonton to a Chinese father and a Scottish-Irish mother, Chong had already lived an entire creative life before comedy ever entered the picture. He'd been a working musician, playing guitar in a band that landed an actual Motown recording contract, a career highlight most people would have chased for decades. Instead, Chong pivoted into nightlife, opening a club in Vancouver where he mixed strip club entertainment with sketch comedy, essentially inventing his own hybrid genre before anyone had a name for it. He wasn't trying to build the next great comedy act. He was trying to make his club stand out. These two men crossed paths purely by accident, in a setting that had nothing to do with either of their artistic ambitions. Marin needed work, Chong needed performers. What happened next wasn't planned, rehearsed, or pitched to anyone. It simply clicked on stage, in front of an audience, during an improvised bit that neither of them saw coming. That's the part people forget. Cheech and Chong weren't invented in a writer's room. They were discovered by accident by two guys who weren't even trying to become a comedy team. Their first big laugh was completely unscripted. Here's something that tends to surprise people. The material that first proved Cheech and Chong had something special wasn't written down anywhere. It happened live, on the fly, during one of their earliest performances together. There was no outline, no punchline drafted in advance, just two performers riffing off each other's energy until the bit built itself in real time. The crowd's reaction told them everything they needed to know. That's the moment their creative chemistry became undeniable, and it set the tone for how they'd work together going forward, loose, improvisational, and built on trust rather than a tightly scripted formula. It's a reminder that some of the most iconic comedy in American pop culture wasn't meticulously engineered. It was stumbled into. The on-screen bond didn't match the off-screen reality. If you grew up watching their films, you probably assumed Cheech and Chong were as close in real life as they appeared on camera. The truth is far messier and honestly more interesting. Cheech has been candid in interviews and in his own memoir that their relationship was never a traditional friendship. He's described it more like a sibling bond, the kind built on years of shared experience and obligation rather than warm affection. Brothers argue. Brothers compete. Brothers can be furious with each other one minute and completely in sync the next. That's a far more accurate description of how these two operated for nearly 2 decades. A huge source of friction came down to creative credit. Even though both men were officially listed as writers across their run of films together, directing duties leaned heavily toward Chong, and that imbalance ate at Cheech over time. He's spoken about feeling like his creative input was minimized, even though he considered himself just as responsible for the tone and success of their movies. This wasn't a minor grumble, it became a genuine sore spot that followed them for years, occasionally spilling out publicly, including moments where the two of them have flatly contradicted each other on camera about who actually deserved directing credit. The tension reached a breaking point in the mid-1980s. By that stage, Cheech felt increasingly shut out of decisions that used to be collaborative, and the balance of power on their sets had shifted noticeably toward Chong wanting full control over the writing and directing process. Things finally came apart when Cheech wanted to record a passion project, a song and short film that meant a great deal to him personally, and Chong declined to be part of it. That refusal effectively ended their partnership as a working comedy duo. Cheech pushed forward with the project alone, and it turned into one of the most successful things he'd done up to that point, which only underscored how much creative energy he'd been holding back for years. What's remarkable is how honestly Chong has owned his part in the breakup. In later interviews, he's admitted that stepping into the director's chair changed him, that having creative authority over the films made him harder to work with, more controlling, and less willing to share the spotlight. He once split evenly with his partner. That kind of self-aware admission from a comedy legend is rare, and it adds real depth to a story that's usually told with a laugh track running underneath it. They did reunite over the years for tours and appearances, but Cheech has been upfront that some of that old tension never fully disappeared. Reconnecting professionally didn't erase 2 decades of built-up frustration. It just meant they'd learned to work around it. They built careers far beyond the smoke. Ask a casual fan what Cheech and Chong have done outside their stoner films, and you'll probably get a shrug. That's a shame because both men have quietly built resumes that go far beyond the characters that made them famous. Cheech Marin, in particular, has one of the more versatile careers of anyone from his comedy generation. His voice work alone spans generations of moviegoers. Younger audiences know him as the wisecracking hyena from a beloved Disney animated classic, and as a spirited lowrider character in a hugely popular animated racing franchise. He's also lent his voice to other animated features aimed at kids, proving he could pivot from raunchy stand-up material to family-friendly entertainment without missing a beat. Beyond animation, Cheech built a serious career in live-action television and film, taking on dramatic and comedic roles that had nothing to do with cannabis culture at all. He's also become one of the most prominent collectors and advocates for Chicano art in the country, using his fame and resources to fund museum exhibitions and elevate artists who otherwise might never have gotten mainstream recognition. That's not something most people associate with the guy from the stoner movies, but it's arguably one of his most meaningful legacies. Tommy Chong has taken a different, but equally unexpected route. His voice and persona have popped up in surprising corners of pop culture, including a memorable animated cameo where he essentially played an exaggerated version of himself for laughs. He's also stepped into more serious territory as a documentary subject, most notably in a film chronicling his real-life legal battle with the federal government over the sale of glass pipes through an online business. That case wasn't a joke. Chong actually served time in federal prison over it, a fact that stands in stark contrast to the laid-back stoner character he built his career playing. The case became a talking point for people who saw it as a disproportionate response driven more by his public image than by the actual offense, and Chong has used that experience to speak more seriously about drug policy and the justice system than his films ever suggested he would. Both men, in their own ways, have spent decades proving that the stoner comedian label barely scratches the surface of who they actually are. The wrestling ring appearance nobody expects. Somewhere in the middle of their long careers, Cheech and Chong ended up in one of the most unlikely settings imaginable, a professional wrestling broadcast. They appeared as guest hosts on a major WWE program, using the appearance to promote a tour they were running at the time. True to form, they didn't just show up and wave. They got involved in an on-air comedy segment with one of the wrestlers, playing up their stoner personas for a live sports entertainment audience that had probably never expected to see them there. It's a strange little footnote in their career, but says a lot about their willingness to show up literally anywhere there was an audience and a stage, no matter how far it was from a comedy club. A horror movie crossover that almost happened. Here's a fact that sounds made up, but isn't. At one point, there was a real pitch on the table to bring Cheech and Chong into a slasher horror franchise. A director working on a sequel in one of the biggest horror series of the 1980s floated the idea of having the duo cross paths with the franchise's iconic masked killer, either as clueless campground employees or as accidental marijuana growers, stumbling into danger in the woods. It never made it past the pitch stage, but just imagine it for a second. 2 mellow, easily distracted stoners wandering obliviously through a horror movie kill count. It would have been an unforgettable piece of genre-clashing cinema, and it's wild to think how close it came to actually happening. A movie prop with a real-life backstory. One of the most memorable sight gags in their film catalog is a novelty license plate spelling out a crude phrase, treated as a throwaway joke buried in a wide shot. What most fans never realized is that the plate wasn't invented by a props department at all. It was based on an actual vanity plate that existed in real life, originally registered to someone with a very different relationship to law enforcement than the stoner characters on screen. That plate had a life of its own before it ever appeared in the film, passing through a few different vehicles over the years before eventually being retired. It's the kind of detail that only surfaces decades later, and it adds a strange layer of authenticity to a joke most audiences assumed was pure fiction. A painful reaction that became a secret weapon. Not every story from their glory days is about tension or rivalry. Some of the best ones are just plain funny. During an early screening of one of their breakout films, a major Hollywood star showed up fresh off a car accident, nursing a genuinely painful shoulder injury, under strict doctor's orders not to laugh. Naturally, the film was too funny for that instruction to hold up. Every big laugh came out as a strained, involuntary groan instead, and according to people who were in the room, the filmmakers actually used those pained reactions as an informal barometer for which jokes were landing hardest. If a joke could make someone laugh through real physical pain, it stayed in the final cut. It's a strange, almost accidental way to test comedy, but it worked. Where the name, Cheech, actually came from. Even something as simple as Cheech Marin's stage name has a backstory most fans never think to ask about. Cheech wasn't a persona cooked up for the movies. It was a nickname that followed him long before he ever set foot on a stage with Tommy Chong. It traces back to a childhood association with chicharron, the crispy fried pork dish, a nod to his Mexican-American heritage that stuck with him through family and friends well into adulthood. By the time he started performing, Cheech wasn't a character he was playing. It was simply who everyone already called him. That detail matters more than it might seem because it points to something real underneath the exaggerated on-screen persona. Marin's stoner character was loud and cartoonish, but the name itself was rooted in his actual identity, not in a writer's room decision. Awards recognition that rarely gets mentioned. For a duo so strongly associated with lowbrow, drug-fueled slapstick, it's easy to forget that their work was taken seriously enough at the time to earn real industry recognition. Their comedy albums, built largely on the same improvisational chemistry that got them discovered in the first place, were successful enough commercially and critically to land them a Grammy Award for Best Comedy Album. That's not a footnote you'd expect from a duo whose entire public image was built around getting high and getting into trouble, but it underlines something important. Underneath the exaggerated characters, they were genuinely skilled writers and performers, disciplined enough to turn loose, improvise bits into tightly constructed, award-worthy recorded material. It's a strange contrast, an act built on the appearance of aimlessness that was in reality meticulously crafted enough to beat out other serious comedic acts of the era. Tommy Chong's prison sentence was longer than most people realize. The documentary about Tommy Chong's legal troubles gets mentioned often, but the actual details of the case tend to get glossed over. Federal investigators built a case against a company Chong was involved with for selling drug paraphernalia across state lines, and despite Chong's argument that he was a minor participant compared to other people involved in the same investigation, he ended up serving roughly 9 months in federal prison. What made the case sting even more for Chong and his supporters was the timing and framing of the whole thing. Critics at the time argued that federal prosecutors specifically wanted a celebrity name attached to the case to generate publicity for a broader crackdown, essentially using Chong's fame against him rather than treating him the same way as anyone else involved. Chong has talked openly since then about how surreal it was to go from playing a beloved, harmless stoner character to actually living behind bars over a business dispute involving glass pipes. It reframes the harmless, goofy stoner image in a much more serious light, and it's part of why Chong later became a genuinely outspoken voice on drug policy reform rather than just playing one for laughs on screen. Cheech's life away from the cannabis persona. One of the more overlooked parts of Cheech Marin's career is just how far he moved from the character that made him famous. Long after the movies stopped coming, he became known in television circles for a completely different kind of role, a straight-laced, sharply dressed police detective on a crime drama series about as far removed from his stoner film persona as a role could possibly get. Audiences who only knew him from the cannabis comedy years were often stunned to see him playing a disciplined, no-nonsense law enforcement character with total conviction. It's the kind of range that rarely gets credited to performers who become as tightly associated with one persona as Cheech did in the 70s and 80s, and it's a big part of why people in the industry have long considered him a far more serious actor than his most famous roles would suggest. Why the real story matters more than the legend. It would be easy to remember Cheech and Chong as nothing more than the guys who made wee jokes mainstream decades before it was culturally acceptable. But the actual story is so much richer than that. It's a story about two men from wildly different backgrounds who never set out to become a comedy team, who built something powerful almost entirely by accident, and who spent years navigating real resentment, competition, and eventually a genuine breakup, all while making audiences laugh harder than almost anyone else in their era. It's a story about reinvention, about a duo whose individual paths afterward took them into animation, activism, art curation, federal courtrooms, and even a wrestling ring, proving there was always more to both of them than the personas that made them famous. The next time you watch one of their movies or hear that familiar back-and-forth banter, it's worth remembering everything that was happening behind the scenes to make that chemistry possible. The tension, the ego, the accidental beginnings, and the years of friction that never fully disappeared, even after they made peace. That's the real story of Cheech and Chong, and honestly, it might be even more compelling than the characters they played on screen.